This week, our guest is Lester Thurow, Professor of Economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He will discuss his book, Head to Head, The Coming Economic Battle Among Japan, Europe, and America.
Lester Thurow, author of Head to Head, The Coming Economic Battle Among Japan, Europe, and America. What brought you to this book this time?
Well, basically, what I argue there is what I really believe, and that is that the world economy in the 21st century is going to be radically different than it was in the 20th century. And in my terms, the world economy begins just 7 months from now, because on the 1st of January 1993, for the first time in 120 years, the United States will be the second largest economy in the world. And a historian of the future looking back will say that the 21st century begins earlier, and we now have a brand new ball game. And the question is, can we understand what that ball game is all about and how we Americans are going to have to be different to play in that ball game?
You think America's ready for being number 2?
No, I think it's going to be a real psychological shock on the 1st of January when it's officially announced that if you want to play Major League Economics, you do it in Europe, and if you want to be a AAA ball player, you do it in the United States. And, you know, that's going to make everybody sit up and take notice.
You say in here that you're really impressed with Japan. You call them exceptional. What do you mean by that?
Well, you know, if you look at what the Japanese are doing to invest in plant and equipment, research and development, skills, and bring everybody up to a very high skill level, it is just absolutely phenomenal. There's no human society that's ever done what they've done as fast as they've done. And their momentum is enormous. I mean, last year they invested basically $2 for every $1 we invested in the United States. And so to keep the sport metaphor going, if you think about going to the weight room to beef up to play the game better, the Japanese are going to the weight room more often and longer than anybody else in the world to play the game.
Why are they doing so well?
Well, the answer, I think, comes back to skills. What the Japanese have discovered is that the trick in the modern world economy is how good are you at making products, delivering services, and to do that, you've got to have a staff that's absolutely first-rate, the people who manufacture the products, deliver the products, and to have that, you've got to have a population that's very well educated from top to bottom. And where the Japanese education system is good is not at the top, but at the bottom. You know, if you look at the very top, we probably in the United States do a better job of education than the Japanese do. But if you look at the bottom half or the bottom quarter, they'll bring that part of their population up to levels of performance that are almost inconceivable by America's standards.
You spend most of your time not writing books?
I spend most of my time trying to run a business school at MIT.
What's MIT stand for?
Massachusetts Institute of Technology.
What kind of a school is it?
It's an engineering and science school, basically. And if you look at what management's trying to do is we're trying to get this linkage between engineering, science, and management so that we can bring that technology into American industry in the way in which it ought to be brought in.
How many students are there?
There are about 11,000 students at MIT in total, and about 1,000 students who are in the business school one way or another.
And it's called the MIT Sloan School of Management.
That's correct.
Who was Sloan?
Sloan was the founder of General Motors, a graduate of MIT way back in the 20s and 30s, and he kind of designed what we could think of as modern American management. And for about 50 years, modern American management was very successful. I think the problem is that the world economy has changed, and if Mr. Sloan was still alive, he would also be changing. But one of the big problems we have in the management area is that we're so locked into that Sloan model coming out of General Motors in the 1930s that a lot of American corporations are finding it very hard to move to different forms of management that are more appropriate in today's world economy.
How long have you been running the school?
5 years.
What did you do before that?
I was a professor of economics at MIT.
What do you think of running a school versus being just a professor?
Well, it's a learning experience, is I think the way you would describe it. What everybody learns if you try and run an operation, and in this case it has probably 1,500 people attached to it, including students, is the name of the game is how do you get human beings to work together without having a failure? And of course that's true in schools, and it's also true in companies, and it's also true in societies. Once you're a failure like the Soviet Union, it's easy to change, or once you're a corporation that's going broke, it's easy to change, or once you're a school that it's a failure, it's an easy to change. But the trick is, how do you change while you're still successful? That's the MIT problem, that's the American corporation problem, that's the American society problem. We're still one of the most successful societies in the world, but in order to remain successful, we have to change. And what a historian is going to look at and say, do we first have to go into failure before we can change? Or are we one of those flexible societies that can change without failure? military and 30% economic, when it's probably going to be 98% military, 98% economic and 2% military. Bill Clinton talks about the middle class, and that is a terribly important problem, except he's talking mostly about tax cuts for the middle class. The real problem is their before-tax income is falling. You got to do something about the education and skills of their children. You got to do something about the industrial structure in America if you're going to help the middle class. Now, Perot, I think, has the great advantage because people see him as a businessman who's interested in the world economy, but we don't know exactly yet what Mr. Perot plans to do about any of these things. So I think his kind of image of being interested in business is the right focus, the economics, but what he's going to do in terms of the policy leadership side, we don't yet know.
Are you surprised that Ross Perot is a player at this point?
No, I'm not, simply because if you look at George Bush, he's the Cold War president. He's got a background in that kind of thing. He's interested in that kind of thing. And I think the public understands the Cold War is over. I'm not sure the president understands the Cold War is over, but the public does. And so those things that were very positive for Mr. Bush in 1988 are in some, like being head of the CIA, are in some sense irrelevant in 1992. I think the problem with Bill Clinton is he's a professional politician. And people say, look, he's been governor of Arkansas, perhaps he's been a good governor of Arkansas, but that doesn't have anything to do with this economic world I'm living in where I seem to be on a down escalator. And so the fact that some independent, see, I know how you could be president of the United States.
How?
Go to court and have your name changed to none of the above, and then run for president, and I'm sure you'll be elected.
You talk about a meeting that was held, this is almost a complete non sequitur, a meeting that was held in Singapore in 1990 between, I believe, was it Daimler-Benz or
It was
or
the Deutsche
Bank?
Bank, Daimler-Benz group, and the Mitsubishi Group of Japan. So the largest business group of Japan and the largest business group in Germany spent 1 week meeting behind closed doors in Singapore.
You said it was a secret meeting.
Secret meeting.
How did you find out about it?
Well, the fact that it was occurring was public knowledge. Now, technically speaking, I don't know what they were talking about, but of course you and I really do know what they were talking about. They were talking about joint strategy, because that's the only thing important enough to get those people to give up a week of their lives sitting in Singapore talking to each other. And the purpose of talking about the meeting is to point out that the rest of the world plays economics differently. We made business groups illegal in the United States in 1933 under the Glass-Steagall Act, and what I argue in the book is we're going to have to change the banking laws and the antitrust laws to once again allow American business groups, because if 26 Japanese companies can get together and plan joint strategy, then you got to make it legal for 26 American companies to get together and plan joint strategy. Now, Bush at the moment is talking about kind of exporting American antitrust laws to Japan, but that's a lot of nonsense. We can't do that. We're not going to do that. We have to play the ball game defined by them as opposed to forcing them to play the American game.
You talked about in January 1 of 93 when the Europeans come together, there's 380 million people trading as a bloc. Is that going to work?
Oh, I think there's going to be a lot. It's a situation where it's 2 steps forward, 1 step backward, 1 step to the side, then another 2 steps forward. We're talking about a 30 to 50-year period of time before the Europeans are really fully integrated, get Eastern Europe involved in it. On the other hand, they're beyond the point of no return, and the best example is Mrs. Thatcher. Mrs. Thatcher didn't like the common market. In some sense, she didn't want it to continue, and the British knew they couldn't survive without it. So if the choice came, stay in the common market or fire your prime minister, they fired a very popular prime minister. And so I think that's very strong evidence that the common market's beyond the point of any breakup. They will have some backward setbacks, but they're going to continue forward. And I think in the 1990s, we'll talk a lot more about Europe and somewhat less about Japan when we start talking about economic competitors.
One of those countries in Europe going to come out the strongest?
Well, clearly the common market is dominated by the German-speaking world, because there are about 100 million German speakers in the middle of Europe, and there are only 50 million British, 50 million French, 50 million Italians. Now, I think we in America are going to be very surprised by how fast countries in Eastern Europe join. I think Czechoslovakia will be an associate member of the common market before the year 2000, and I think we're going to be surprised how fast the Russians come in. Because if I'm sitting in England, France, or Italy, I've got a problem. There are 50 million of me, and there are 100 million Germans, and if I don't want this to be a German-dominated common market, I've got to get some group into the common market big enough to counterbalance the Germans, and the Russians are the only group. And I think we're going to be surprised at how fast countries like Russia join.
Are the Germans good at what they do?
The Germans are the world's best at basically being exporters. 60 million Germans exported more than 120 million Japanese, and on a per capita basis, they were far ahead of Japan in terms of being a world exporter. Now, we Americans didn't notice because the Germans tend to export machine tools and factory equipment that we don't see, and for some reason we don't remember that every Mercedes we see is the equivalent of 5 Japanese cars when it comes to dollar value. And so the Germans are phenomenally successful on world markets.
You got a statistic about that in the book, the number of German luxury cars sold here and the profit margins compared to the number of Japanese cars. Can you give us more on that?
You know, basically, even though the Japanese were selling maybe 10 cars for every 1 European car, if you looked at the dollar value, it wasn't anything like in that relationship, because you were getting German cars coming in at an average value of $50,000 while you were getting Japanese cars coming in at an average value of $12,000. And so, you know, it is interesting. Of course, the Japanese say we're racist because of it, and that is that we yell about them having an export surplus with the United States, and we don't yell about Germany having an export surplus with the United States. I don't think it really is racism. I think it's simply a fact that for some reason German exports come in areas which are almost invisible, while Japanese exports come in very visible areas like video recorders, cameras. You see the brand names every day.
Will the Japanese luxury cars like Lexus and
Infiniti
and others push the German cars out of the market over time, do you think?
Well, they're certainly doing it at the moment, and that's one of the things that's got the Europeans very worried, and it's, of course, one of the reasons why they're building barriers in Europe to keep the Japanese cars out. See, I think we're going to see a lot of trade disputes between Europe and Japan in the 1990s, because if you walk around the common market and talk to either government or business leaders, you'll hear everybody privately say, we're not going to let the Japanese do in Europe what they've done in America. And the former Prime Ministress of France, in some sense, got in trouble for saying publicly what everybody else was saying privately. And so I think you're going to see a lot of trade disputes, basically, between Japan and Europe. And in some sense, that's probably a good thing from an American point of view, because it means that we don't have all of these arguments between ourselves and the Japanese. They got somebody else to fight with other than we Americans.